Hi, everybody. Welcome to The Scoop for the week of October 3rd. I'm so happy you're here. This is our very first edition number 1 of The Scoop, which is a special report we're doing every week for our insider community that we just launched on Smarter News. And I'm so excited for this. You know, Smarter News is developed around the idea of quick, concise, nonpartisan information. I like to talk about it as small bites of information, like a tapas bar. You're getting a little bit of something throughout the week that you can trust. And over a period of time, those small bites really do add up. But we're also in a point in the news cycle and in our growth of Smarter News that I want to give you a little something extra. And so that's where the idea for a scoop of something comes in. It's an expression in journalism. You can get a scoop. You got the first scoop, an exclusive scoop on a story. I was looking it up in the dictionary just to be sure. You always have to double and triple source, even though I've heard that term used forever. But really, a scoop referencing information is just a grouping of information together. And that's what we're going to do on Mondays. Because I don't know about you, if Monday starts well, then the rest of the week seems smoother. And if we're about delivering smarter news, then perhaps we can give you a scoop of information at the beginning of the week, really set a foundation for you. So you're not in the rat race of trying to get these updates all the time, because you have an idea of what the stories are about going into the week. And yes, breaking news can happen. Of course, we're going to cover that. And you feel that underneath your feet. So it drops the anxiety level a little bit. This certainly does for me when I go into the week of Smarter News, but also my family life, just having an idea of, well, what are the big things that I absolutely need to know? So I'm not caught off guard in any sort of conversation. And I have an idea of what's happening in the world. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about the things that you need to know here at home, the things you need to know abroad. And we're going to kind of mix them together. We're going to talk a little bit, and this is going to be unique to this particular broadcast. We're not only going to give you the news, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the editorial decisions that are being made really in newsrooms all across the country and why they matter and how we're approaching some of these editorial decisions as well, that I hope sets us apart a little bit. So I'm really glad you're here. Thank you for your support of nonpartisan news and supporting a free press. My job is a customer service job. I want to deliver the news to you, so it frees up your time. You know, journalists are supposed to be checking headlines all the time. You're supposed to be living your life. We're here to be in the trenches for you. You're supposed to be out there doing the fun things and then getting the reports at the end of the day. And with the internet and social media, it just seems like everybody's chasing the next big headline or the next big update. I want us to kind of recenter ourselves, recalibrate. That's actually my word for this particular period of Smarter News. And I think this period in America, we're recalibrating, you know, what is really important to us? What do we really need to know? And how can we do the best with the resources we have to live the life that we want to live? So this is sort of a part of the sort of news that I want to deliver and a part of the life that I want to live, that I get to meet you here on this platform where we can talk about a bunch of different things. We're going to be using some new technology. And so you're going to be hearing some sounds, seeing some images. It's all a work in progress. So this is just the beginning. And there's a lot to go from here. So we're going to do something old fashioned. You know how I like doing old fashioned things. I'm actually going to show you a calendar. I like showing you maps, calendars. These are real basic, but I want us to look at the month of October because this is the first Monday in the month of October. And really now we are in the intensity of the midterm election season. And I want to show you this because really any sort of political news that you hear from this point on has to have that little kind of a haze over it, sort of a veneer over it when you're looking at it, to understand that we're looking at politicians and decisions being made in a midterm election cycle. That doesn't explain every behavior or every comment, but we're in it now. We're only a few weeks away from Halloween. So hopefully you have that all set up in your house. We have a couple things going in our house, including a monster truck and an army man, which is big news in a house where the dad is Navy, by the way. But we're working through it. We also have a Renaissance princess fairy. So this is what we're doing in our household. But you can see we're just a couple weeks away from Halloween. And then as soon as Halloween is over, the next week is the midterm elections. That's going to really set the stage for what the House of Representatives is going to look like for the next 2 years. It's going to be an indicator perhaps on how the American public feels about politics in America. So this is going to be a really intense, interesting time, and I'm glad we're together for that. So let's talk a little bit about where everybody is this week, What do we need to know here at home? I always like to know where the president is. We always need to know, where's the president going? We don't often get a heads up many days in advance of his schedule, but we know where he's going today. He's going to be in Puerto Rico. We know Puerto Rico dealt with Hurricane Fiona and still is struggling to recover from that storm. So the president is going to be spending the day there. We expect him in Florida, according to reports, later on in the week. We know there was a huge hurricane there. Let's talk a little bit about what happened with Hurricane Ian, just briefly here. I know you're getting a lot of news on it. And I'm going to start with something that just reminds us, in a world where there's a lot of controversy, we have images that remind us that there's really good people that are standing by to help us in our time of need. And if you're in Florida, you're probably dealing with a lot of different things, a lot of different variables, depending on where you are. But a broad swath of the state was without power, without electricity. And what you're looking at are some of the utility drivers that were on standby from all over the country to rush to Florida. You have tens of thousands of them on the ground, making sure that electricity comes back to the state of Florida. And I was reading an interview earlier today. You're going to see that in the newsletter that accompanies this report. But they're not staying at nice hotels. They're working around the clock. One of the guys says, "Oh, I have a cot I can sleep on." And so that's good. I'm trying to get some rest, but we're really working around the clock to make sure that Florida gets back up and running. That's going to be the key to so many other things falling into place, because if you don't have power, then the recovery is so much harder. Let's just talk about hurricane season for a moment here. This was a historic storm. And isn't it difficult now, because we've had so many different forecasts over the years? It's tough to know, well, was this actually the storm that forecasters thought it was going to be? And the reality is, yes, unfortunately, Hurricane Ian was that storm. It was an extremely strong storm. But one of the lessons I learned early on as a journalist who lived in a part of the country where there weren't hurricanes. I lived in San Francisco, California. I could talk about earthquakes, but I couldn't talk about hurricanes. And I'll never forget really learning that even though there's so much focus on wind speed, that's how we know if it's a category 1, 2, 3, 4, that really when it comes to the disaster that hurricanes can bring, it's about the floodwaters. And we saw this incredible storm surge in Florida. Flooding remains a major issue. And sometimes you can't rush the waters to recede. Flooding and the damage that it leaves are weeks and months in the making. So that's important to know about this story. The other thing I think is important is that hurricane season, we have 2 more months going back to that calendar. Hurricanes are very unique. Tornadoes, no season. Tornadoes can happen any time of the year. That's why you get some in random times like December or January. You think, wait, is this really when tornadoes are going to happen? No, for hurricane season, hurricanes are specifically between June 1st and November 30th. So we have 2 more months. The forecast for hurricane season is going to be above normal. And so there was a chance that was going into hurricane season. That's what we thought we were going to have. So we still have another 2 months to watch storms. We also know that there's one off the Pacific coast going to Mexico this week. We're going to be watching the activity. Speaking of the midterm elections, it just takes one unexpected event to just change things. Everyone has these formulas about what things are going to look like. What is the future going to hold? Well, there can be unexpected events that happen. Weather is one of them that you always have to leave a little room for. So I just want to make sure that we know about that. The other thing that we should note today is that the Supreme Court is back in session. They had a summer break. Now they're back in session. And it is a historic start to the Supreme Court. For the first time ever, you have 4 women sitting on the court. You also have Justice Jackson, who's the first Black woman who's going to be sitting on the court. She's sitting on the court today. She was confirmed months and months ago, but it was Friday when she officially took her seat on the mahogany bench. That, can't you just picture mahogany? You don't even need to the dark wood that's all it has to be around any serious courtroom. So she took her seat. This is an image, by the way. We reached out to the Supreme Court. We saw this image circulating, and we wanted to confirm it for you. But this actually happened on Friday, where the women of the Supreme Court got together. The 4 of them took a photo. And now they're hearing cases. They're hearing cases today. The one today has to do, just loosely, generally speaking, has to do with, federal regulations and property rights when it comes to water. So we have a little bit more of that in our newsletter if you'd like to read more about it. There's a couple cases we're going to be really watching this session. One has to do with race in university admission process. One has to do with how your private beliefs intersect with your business, especially when it comes to weddings and different preferences of brides and grooms and the business people that serve these weddings. So we'll be watching the Supreme Court go through these cases, and periodically we will preview them for you as we hear the arguments. But remember, we don't get any decisions from the Supreme Court until, really next June. And so it's a long time to wait. An unsolved mystery in the Supreme Court remains: who leaked the document of the decision, the draft decision of that very important case that reestablished abortion law in America? We still don't know who did that. And one of the questions I have is, how will that impact this term? Will we see other leaks? Was that a precedent being set? Is that person still inside the court somewhere? Is that something that as a journalist, I'm going to need to prepare for and also prepare you for? Because in the past, that just wasn't something that you could even really imagine. For all the leaks that happened around Washington, D.C., that wasn't one that I even thought would happen, just because of the way that the court can try to maintain its ability to separate itself as a branch of government. So just the fact that we don't have any leads, I think, is a story. So that's something to note. Final thing to note this week, this kind of comes to your home base. Every month we get this jobs report. It's a report card on the job market. We expect job growth last month. One of the things we're going to be watching is whether or not we are in a recession, and we're going to be looking at the data that comes in on that over the next several weeks, because the data is a sign potentially that you're in a recession. What some people are looking at is, are we in any sort of a recession that has to do with the labor recession? Doesn't seem like that right now, because the job market continues to add jobs. So we want to see the pace of the jobs. We want to see how active the job market looks. And we're really looking at this because the holiday season is so important for all companies. If they can make a lot during the next few months, it could change their entire year. And so something to watch out for. We just saw an article on it this morning. A colleague of mine flagged it for me right away. I sat up straighter because I happen to be on the apps of all these companies like Target, Walmart. These major retailers are going to be starting their sales early. They're going to try to hype you up about the holidays early, not just holiday decorations, just getting you in the door and getting you shopping. One of the things that they've had a trouble with is managing their inventory because of these supply chain issues. They don't really know. They're still kind of figuring that out. It's still a major issue for retailers. And have you noticed, this happened to me once recently on Amazon. I went to return something and Amazon said, no, just keep it. I was like, what? Like, just keep it? Like, I don't even want it, really. Well, for these retailers, it's cheaper for them to refund you and you keep that item, whatever it is, than for them to repackage it, restock it, put it out again. So that might be something that you're noticing, but pay attention. If you're looking for sales, this is something that you might be seeing a lot more of over the next several weeks, and it's going to start early. This whole idea of Black Friday this year, I expected even earlier than that you're going to see a lot of those sales. So something to note. In the meantime, I want to talk to you a little bit about what's happening overseas. We have a couple big stories that are taking place, and I'm going to pull up some video here. And actually, maybe before I get to the video, well, let's see. I'm going to go for it. Let's just show the video. The video that I have here is from the Swedish Coast Guard. One of the big stories that we've been watching overseas has to do with Russia and Ukraine, as you know. So I'm just going to switch gears and we're going to gaze overseas here for a little bit. So what you're seeing on your screen, and if you're not watching, just so you know, you're seeing what was the pipe damage in the Nord Stream pipeline. I'm going to show you a map of that in just a moment. But you're seeing this big bubble basically in the middle of the Baltic Sea. Like, it's something like you've never really seen before. And the update to this story is, according to the Coast Guard, the Swedish Coast Guard, there's no more of this massive rippling on the surface. So that may be a sign that most of the natural gas that was in the pipe is no longer there. Maybe. It's tough to know. I mean, Nord Stream is majority owned by Russia, a Russian company. So quite frankly, it's tough to really have transparent information. In fact, I checked the Nord Stream website. There's no updates other than, oh yeah, we're looking into this change of pressure in our pipe. Remember, NATO called this sabotage, as well as the American president. And they're not naming who they think it's sabotage for, but the thinking is that they're pointing the finger at Russia or somebody that's aligned with Russia. Russia is pointing the finger back at the West and saying, oh, we didn't do this. This pipeline is critical because it has in the past brought about 35% of natural gas to Europe. And once the natural gas goes through the pipe, it's usable. So there was natural gas sitting in this pipe when this happened. It wasn't flowing to Europe because Russia had stopped it. And as Russia has done periodically over the last decade, can start or stop or decrease shipments to Europe, how they're feeling about different political situations. So that was already happening. There wasn't natural gas actively going to Europe. But remember, going back to the calendar, we're going into the winter season. Europe really has to figure out where they're getting some natural gas to heat homes and power factories and all that. So this is really important to remember. This is a very big story. And one of the reasons why it's such a big story is because we're always watching, when does that conflict in Ukraine go outside the border of Ukraine? This happened in international waters. When we look back on big conflicts, World War I, World War II, you're in the movies, it's always like a big moment that suddenly everybody gets in a battle. But the reality is that the conditions for this happening, for conflict happening, can be a slow creep of a lot of different events. And because whatever sabotage this may or may not be, we can't even confirm that for you. I can't, certainly. Is it a sign of an escalation of the conflict? Is it a foreshadowing of something to come? When is this going to be fixed? I talked to an expert on this, by the way, about fixing pipelines. And he said it was very interesting. Listen, if this was sabotage and there was an explosion, he said we could actually fix it pretty easily because it's contained. It's not like the pipe disintegrated because it's been on the floor for the last 50 years. You could actually fix it rather quickly. So the fact we don't have any updates on anybody fixing this raises concern, because even if Russia was never going to deliver natural gas to Europe this winter, at least if the pipeline was functioning, they could. And you never know how a story may develop. So getting this completely offline, and let me just show you this map so you can see it. You can see how this looks between Russia and right to Germany, where it goes through the rest of Europe. You have two pipelines that are kind of running parallel next to each other. Both of them have damage. This is a really big deal. So the fact that we don't have any updates on this today is notable. I think this is a big deal going into the next several weeks, and one that I think we should continue to watch. In the meantime, what is happening inside Ukraine? What's going on with Russia? Why would Russia annex or take certain territory from Ukraine, hold big events, and then have to deal with something on their pipeline? What is going on here? Well, the former national security advisor to President Trump, H.R. McMaster, who served in the U.S. military for decades under many different presidents and many different politicians, had this to say this weekend, and I wanted you to hear it.
The Russian army in Ukraine, a moral collapse. And I think they must really be at a breaking point if you look at just the numbers of casualties, the vast area that they're trying to defend. And now, of course, Russia is trying to mobilize conscripts and send them to the front untrained. And I think it's very important to also understand that these forces that are in full retreat now out of Lyman were really the first round of mobilization. Remember when Putin was trying to recruit more and more people with paying about 3 times the average wages to get so-called volunteers to go forward? Those forces were hastily trained, thrown into that front, and these are the forces that are collapsing just right now.
So important to note here, there's a lot of different analysis about the state of the war in Ukraine. It's difficult to know what's true. What is true from what we can see from the Russian press and from the announcements from Russia themselves is that the war has come home to Russians. So if you're a 35-year-old software developer in Russia with 2 kids and you suddenly get a knock on your door that you're going to go train for the Russian military, your life has dramatically changed. And so did the life of your family. That changes the political dynamic inside Russia. And that certainly is something to watch. Weather is a factor. We talk about the hurricanes. We talk about what you never know. Going into these winter months in Europe is going to make it much harder to fight. And so we're at an intersection here in Ukraine and Russia in this conflict that feels important. I'm not sure which direction it's going to go. I'm curious what you think of this story. You've heard a lot about it. Think about last year at this time. None of us were talking about Ukraine. Very few of us were talking about Ukraine, barely talking about Russia. And now it's one of the biggest stories in front of us. Just a reminder how quickly things can change. I'm curious your level of interest on this. It seems important. We know Russia has the most nuclear weapons in the entire world. We know that there's always this question of further conflict. So let me know what you think about this. Real quick here, I want to spend one more moment before we move to a little bit of a media analysis, which I'm excited about. I want to talk to you a little bit about Iran, because Iran, as you know, is a U.S. state designated state sponsor of terror. It's designated by the U.S. government as a state sponsor of terror, which means it supports terrorism groups around the world. And this is the Ayatollah. He's the supreme leader of Iran. We saw him for the very first time in weeks today. He was at what's comparable to like a police academy graduation in Iran. And we have been watching protests that came from the death of a young woman who apparently wasn't wearing her head covering, her hijab, correctly or at all. We don't really know exactly what happened, but she died in government custody after being arrested by morality police, because that is what they're supposed to do. You know, keep everybody looking a certain way, because that is according to their interpretation of Islam in the country. The protests in Iran are continuing, and they're continuing at a very, very high rate. They're happening all over the country. In fact, just over the last 24 hours, there was a huge protest at one of the major universities in Tehran, the capital of Iran. So this is not going anywhere. The endurance of the protesters and the impact of them to continue to show up despite the risk. This is not like other countries where you can protest and not fear retribution. You could be killed, you could be tortured, you could be arrested. There's no question about that. And yet they're showing up, and it's the youth of the country that are showing up. Why are we watching this? We're watching this because we want to know, will the pressure from the public create any change in Iran? We're curious about this because we know the regime in power has been labeled a state sponsor of terror going back to the 1970s. And we wonder, could that ever change? We also know that there's a nuclear deal negotiation taking place between America and Iran at different paces at different times. We know there's a concern about Iran getting nuclear weapons. There's a lot packed in here, but it's really the people on the ground, the people in the streets that are not going anywhere. And I want to tie these two stories together. By the way, Iran apparently, according to U.S. intelligence, has supplied Russia with drones in Ukraine. So there's a relationship between these two countries. I want to just tell you two things that I think are important. The rhetoric coming from Russia and Iran are the same from the leadership. So, for example, the Ayatollah today, this is what he's saying about the riots. This rioting, I'm saying the word riots. What is a protest to some is riots to others. You got to be real careful of your language. You know how I use this as here in the United States, because you may have a protest in the morning that turns into a riot in the evening. I'll use the term riot if the police department says it's a riot, because that means that they're able to use different tactics and techniques and allows more resources to go to the area. So, for example, if there was a protest that was peaceful in the morning, but then it turns into a riot in the evening, I'll make sure that we know that it could be both things together. And then in different hours, it can look different. But I was looking down at this word riot by the Ayatollah, and that's not the term that I would use to describe the protests that are happening in Iran. So apologies about that. But he said this rioting was planned. I say clearly that these riots and insecurities were designed by America and the Zionist regime. He's talking about our allies, Israel, and their employees. So he's saying the West is to blame for this. Equally, Vladimir Putin saying that as well. In a speech just recently, he said this: they, speaking of the West and America, they do not want us to be free. They want us to be a colony. They do not want equal cooperation. They want to loot. They do not want us to see us as a free society, but a mass of soulless slaves. We will continue to defend our values and our motherland, he continues. So know that America is being squarely to blame for what's happening in Iran in the streets. And also what Russia's saying is Russia just going in and trying to help free the people of Ukraine, which continues to be something that Vladimir Putin talks about. It's very difficult to cover these two stories. Just as a journalist from the outside, there's no freedom of the press. And it's a factor. It is a factor for me. It is difficult. We see so many different videos on the protests of Iran. There's no reason to doubt that they're taking place. The BBC Persia covers them. So I look at their outlets a lot just to see what they're seeing, because you do have some European press on the ground in Iran. You don't have a lot of American press there. Same with Russia. So it can be very difficult to know and to confirm. I mean, here's an example. I saw this picture from the Supreme Court, the picture I showed you earlier, It was all over social media in places that I pretty much trust, good sources about the Supreme Court. But I didn't feel comfortable using it because I wanted to be sure it wasn't in any of the Supreme Court's press releases. So I actually wrote the Supreme Court this morning. They got back to Smarter News and said, yes, here's actually the original photo. You can credit it in this way. And that made me feel better. It certainly is difficult when you don't have a spotlight on you. The story matters, the story that the people are telling each other, but also the story to the outside world matters. And it is difficult to confirm, videos from Iran and no, this is a protest from yesterday, not a protest from a couple years ago. And to be able to timestamp it and understand it. This is why when you shut down the internet, as the government has, it's a tool to stop people from organizing and to take away momentum so they don't feel as energized. And that's a question for Iran about whether or not the people start to lose momentum because of these crackdowns that are taking place there. Okay, real quick here. We're kind of wrapping up. I want to talk to you about one story that I saw last week. And I thought, man, this is a great story to talk about on Scoop about editorial judgment. So Vice President Harris was heading overseas. She had this big overseas trip. And it was to Asia, to our very important allies, Japan and South Korea. We know that this really matters, these allies, because we're constantly watching China. We're also watching North Korea, also a state sponsor of terror that has nuclear weapons. As Vice President Harris was actually leaving, North Korea is firing off test missiles as she's leaving to travel to this region. And then even when she was going home, they're repeatedly testing missiles, trying to remind people about their power and their stature. Of course, the vice president doesn't go to North Korea. We don't have diplomatic relations. They're a state sponsor of terrorism. She's there for our allies for a series of different events. We're also watching Vice President Harris because this is an important position. This is, second in line for the presidency. There's a question about who would be potentially running for president from the Democratic Party. And so this is something we're watching for her, how she's being positioned by the party to take a larger role or not. So during her trip, she did a couple different things. She, visited important leaders in both countries, but she made a mistake. And I just want to share this mistake with you. What she said, and just because it's quick and you may not hear it. She had just visited this important area between North and South Korea. And she's talking about our alliance with South Korea, which is a really important alliance. But she mistakenly says North Korea, referencing a state sponsor of terrorism, in which is not an ally. So just listen to this.
The United States shares a very important relationship, which is an alliance with the Republic of North Korea. And it is an alliance that is strong and enduring.
So that's not true. It's not a strong and enduring alliance. Maybe someday that's what the goal is, that we break through to North Korea, but it didn't happen. What I was watching, what hasn't certainly happened now, what I've been watching is the way that the press covered this, because it was an unfortunate mistake and a notable mistake. And so you'll have some outlets cover it as replay that soundbite constantly, instead of even covering her trip or the fact that North Korea is firing off missiles or anything that's happening with China. They're going to focus on this mistake. It is a notable mistake. And in fact, what I'm going to show you next is a headline that doesn't mention the mistake at all. And in fact, the coverage didn't even really go into the mistake. And I thought this is such an interesting editorial debate within a newsroom about how to cover this. And it's just something to be sensitive about. You really have to watch how different media organizations take and pick different pieces of the news and replay it ad nauseum, because that is an editorial choice that they're making. And actually, I think both are probably wrong. You can't cover the trip without mentioning this mistake. It would be editorially dishonest because it was such a big mistake. But just focusing on the mistake is also not really productive. It doesn't have a lot of news value. And being that China is something that we're really keeping an eye on, we're worried about what's happening in Taiwan. We're worried about a resurging China and an aggressive China. And these allies like South Korea and Japan are really important to us. That's a way that we could focus on this trip and broaden it out and not just focus on the mistake. Here's what I would like to see. In my ideal world, here's how I would approach this story. Of course, we would mention the trip. We would mention what's going on. We would mention the mistake. But here's how you could actually go deeper with this story. And I think you would like to go deeper on these stories and not just hear the headlines. I want you to think about this for a second. think about Iran and Russia, how much time we spent talking about them, and the image that you have of both countries in your mind. In my lifetime, I don't think I've ever seen or heard of a relationship with either country that could ever seem productive or open. And yet, in the matter of one generation, look at how much has changed between Japan and South Korea. I mean, America was at war, World War II and the Korean War in this part of the world. These were violent, terrible conflicts. America dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. And now they're one of our greatest allies. We were at war with them, outright war. It's in the most violent and aggressive way. And now we're visiting as allies and looking at how we can align ourselves to help each other. And it's just a reminder that can, one, there's a possibility. And 2, it brings up this debate about whether or not aggression, the use of force, actually positions people in a relationship where they could eventually become allies. That's been a debate as old as time. And I'm not suggesting that dropping bombs does that, but it's an interesting question to ask. Well, how do we go from outright war with Japan and in the Koreas to now being allies? And is that even possible with Russia and Iran? Like, what are the differences? Why would that not happen there? Or should we be open to that possibility of happening? We don't entertain the possibility that things can dramatically change enough. And there's reminders that are in our near history that they change all the time. And I think that's something we should talk about more. I think that's something I'd like to go deeper on. So I'm curious your thoughts on that. That can be difficult for a 3-minute segment on television, but I think it's possible for something like Smarter News. And it's right in front of us. It's right there. You know, even a few decades ago, the thought that the vice president of the United States is going to go visit Japan for a state funeral and to be there as a show of alliance between our two countries was just like not even possible. And now it happens more frequently than we even think. So I think that's really important. Okay, we're going to wrap up here. I have something kind of fun to show you here. Speaking of what's set in stone, have you been to Mount Rushmore? I'm curious about that. I just went this summer. I want to show it to you because this week, what we're going to be watching and we're going to be marking for you is the construction that begins on Mount Rushmore. If you're watching, you're seeing on your screen my little girl Liberty as we're walking up to Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, which, by the way, I just had no idea what to expect. I had never been there. I love that my kids saw it at 7 and 6 years old and 2 years old at the time. I mean, I didn't see any part of this country as a young person, and it's just miraculous. Driving up to Mount Rushmore, you're like in these, kind of like in the very hilly area. There's big rocks. And then all of a sudden you come around the bend and there's the faces of the presidents. It's just amazing. It's just amazing. Well, a couple of things I want you to know about this. I thought this would be fun. One is that there was a project, this idea. Remember, it took 14 years to do this. No one was significantly injured or killed despite the height or the fact that dynamite was used repeatedly to make these intricate carvings on the rock. It's amazing that that was never done, that didn't happen. And the project was just, think of so big, think of the technology now, what they were able to do. And so one of the important things that I learned was that there's actually another part of the rock that the artist believed that if we wanted to carve additional faces in, we would be able to. And in the 1940s, it was found, he actually had a letter, I believe it was in 1940 by Gutzon Borglum. He's the main sculptor. And he's talking about this. He says, if we decide that the west side of the mountain is suitable, I am for it. He's saying, I am for it to go carve it. We must work out a design that is fitting and in no sense harmful in the matter of lighting or location to subjects determined upon. And I am entirely in favor of carving the faces of 2 or 3 women. 1940. The evolution of this was that, he was thinking about it during his time on the mountain, apparently. Others were as well. And women were really key to making this take place, to making Mount Rushmore what it is, including his wife. I'm going to read you a segment of what she said in a moment. But they were thinking about it. It never came to fruition. And so I'm curious, if you could put additional faces in Mount Rushmore, number 1, would you? And number 2, who would it be? Can be women if you'd like. It could not be women. It could be other people. I'm curious, who would you put there? And would it be worth it? Because you never know what could happen to the other faces. So what do you think about that? I want to read this from Mary Borglum. She had this to say. I just thought it was so powerful, just considering the times that we've been through and the news cycle we've been through together. I want you to listen to this. She said, a nation's memorials are a record of its civilization, and the artist who builds them is the instrument of his time. He is inspired by the same forces that influenced the nation's destiny. The greater the period, the greater the art. The artist cannot escape his destiny. And I just love that. I mean, I just think, wow, what art could be created in this time period that we're coming out of, which has been rough in a lot of cases. And I know sometimes it doesn't feel like it's necessarily over, but we certainly have been through a historic time period. So I'm excited to show you more of our trip to Mount Rushmore, but that's an early peek for you today. Quick final thing before I go, one of the perks to being part of this Smarter Insider group and getting our report on Monday is you get a first look at different items that we're going to have, different partnerships we have, and special discounts. And it's funny, just to give you an idea, I was a little bit nervous, I have to admit. We got a lot of new things coming. We're trying to work through them all, and you'd like to think it just is seamless. It's always harder than you think. It always is. And, but I'm still grateful for it. One of the things I've been doing to myself over the last couple of days is picking up items that I really need and putting them down and like literally can't find them. I have no idea where they are. I'll find them eventually. But I was going to show you today our brand new sweatshirt. I picked it up this morning to bring it in because it's been sitting. I've been waiting to share it with you. I have no idea in the house where it is. No idea. Zero. It's gone, but it's a really cute, what we're calling our Campfire Hoodie. Guys, if you're watching this, you're like, I can't wear pink. I totally understand. Don't worry. There's a design coming for you in a little bit, but we wanted to make sure we got this out now because it's a cool color. We're calling it our sunset pink, and it's a sweatshirt that actually can be worn in a couple different ways. And you could check out the link. I'll make sure to put that under the video so you guys can check it out, but you get a 15% off coupon, and you only get that coupon if you have our newsletter, which is our insider newsletter. So if you haven't joined our community, please do so, and you'll get some early looks on this. This really matters because in our supply chain issues, even for a small business, we have limited supply. And so I want to make sure you get first dibs and you get a special discount. So how did you think it went? What do you think so far? What would you like to hear more of? What would you like to hear less of? My goal was about 25 minutes. I know I'm far beyond that, but it'll get better. I promise you. And maybe you want it to be longer. I don't know. I'd love to hear from you about what would you like and what you think would be most helpful to you. We always like to do this a little bit later in the day on Monday, midday, because there's always a rush to news at the beginning of the day. Then there's more news as people announce things on Monday morning, and you kind of want to sift through it and make sure there's nothing that you're missing. Of course, breaking news can happen at any time, and if and when it does, which it will, we'll be there for you for that. So I look forward to your questions, your comments, your thoughts, and I am deeply grateful that you're here on this momentous, historic occasion. October 3rd is important. Tomorrow we'll celebrate Mount Rushmore. But today, historic moment for Smarter News. We're building something different. Hopefully it doesn't take 14 years, but it may, and I'm going to be here for it. So thank you so much for your support. We look forward to your feedback. I'll be commenting along with you under this video, especially on our insider platform. So thank you again. And I'll see you with more throughout the week on smarternews.com. Have a great one, and I'll talk to you soon.